The show opens in 1945 during World War II. Craigh Randall, a combat nurse, is tending to wounded soldiers in a fierce battleground. However, the atmosphere soon lifts when a messenger informs them that the war is finally over. 6 months after World War II ended in Europe, Craigh travels through the Scottish Highlands with her husband, Frank Randall. They are on a second honeymoon in Inverness, trying to reconnect after years apart. During the war, Craigh served in France while Frank worked with MI6 in London, sending spies behind enemy lines. When they arrive at their bed and breakfast, they notice blood smeared on the doorway and other houses in the area. Their landlady, Mrs. Baird, explains it's a tradition involving a black rooster to honor Saint Audrin. Frank impresses her with his knowledge of the saint's story, and Craigh proudly mentions that Frank is a historian who will soon start teaching at Oxford. Mrs. Baird tells them about the upcoming Samhain festival, and warns that ghosts are said to roam during this time. Later that night, Craigh reflects on how she and Frank were apart for most of the past 5 years, and how difficult it's been to return to how things were before the war. They share a playful moment, jumping on their squeaky bed and laughing together. Frank admits he often drew the lines of Claire's hand during the war, even getting in trouble for doing so in official reports. The next day, the couple explores the Highlands by car. Frank points out Cocknaman Rock, which resembles a rooster's tail, and explains how British soldiers used the area to ambush Scottish rebels. Craigh doesn't mind Frank's love for history, as she reveals that she grew up with her archaeologist uncle, who took her on digs around the world. After driving for some time, the couple arrives at Castle Leoch. It happens to be the ancestral home of the Mackenzie clan of the Highlands, as part of Frank's research into his family history. While Frank is focused on history, Craigh enjoys studying plants and herbs for their medicinal properties. Later, they visit Reverend Wakefield, who helps Frank research his ancestor, Jonathan Randall, a British Army captain from the 18th century. Frank shares that Jonathan was nicknamed Black Jack during his time in the Highlands. The Reverend explains that Jonathan was in charge at Fort William, and was notorious for harassing the locals. When Craigh mentions hearing someone call them Sassenachs at a pub, the Reverend explains it means Englishman or outsider. While staying at the Reverend's home, Craigh meets Mrs. Graham, the housekeeper, who reads her palm. She mentions signs of a journey, multiple strangers, and even Claire's husband. She reveals Craigh has a strong will, a passionate nature, and predicts that she will have 2 marriages, though her marriage line isn't fully broken. Meanwhile, Frank and the Reverend discuss Frank's ancestor, Black Jack Randall. They speculate he may have had a powerful patron, possibly the Duke of Sandringham, who was rumored to be a Jacobite. Feeling uneasy after Mrs. Graham's reading, Craigh quietly walks back to the inn. She reminds herself to live in the moment, as the war had taught her not to dwell on the future. However, she has no idea that her life is about to change drastically. At the inn, Craigh is getting ready for bed just as a storm rages outside. While Frank is returning, he sees a man in a kilt staring up at Claire's window. When he approaches, the man silently walks away and disappears into the cold night. Shaken, Frank rushes to the room and looks out the window. When Craigh asks what's wrong, he says he's not sure if he just saw a ghost. Early the next morning, the couple climbs the hill at Craigh Nadan, a circle of standing stones, and watches robed women, including Mrs. Graham, dance in a mysterious ceremony. When the women leave, they explore the stones and the surrounding area. Craigh collects plants while Frank examines the rocks. When one of the women returns for something, they quietly leave. Later in Inverness, Craigh decides to return to Craigh Nadan to gather a plant she saw. As she collects the plant, a strange noise fills the air. Curious, she touches the central stone, and everything suddenly goes black. Moments later, Craigh wakes up in confusion and hears gunfire everywhere. She then stumbles onto what seems to be a battle between redcoats from the British military and kilted Scots. At first, she assumes it's a movie set, but when a soldier fires a live shot at her, she realizes it's all real. Fleeing through the woods, Craigh is pursued by redcoats until she encounters a soldier kneeling by a stream. Surprisingly enough, he looks exactly like her husband. She calls out to him in confusion, only to realize he is not Frank. The man introduces himself as Jonathan Randall, captain of His Majesty's 8th Dragoons. Alarmed, Craigh attempts to run, but Randall stops her and interrogates her. She quickly fabricates a story, claiming that her husband is Frank Beauchamp, a teacher. Randall grows suspicious and demands the truth, but when Craigh spits in his face, he assaults her. Before he can go further, Murdoch Fraser, a Scottish soldier, knocks Randall unconscious and orders Craigh to follow him. As redcoats approach, Craigh tries to call for help, but Murdoch renders her unconscious. When Claire regains consciousness, she finds herself in a horse with Murdoch. He takes her to a cottage where a group of Highlanders, led by Mackenzie, interrogate her. Using her maiden name, Beauchamp, Claire avoids revealing her connection to Frank. Shifting his focus, Dougal addresses one of his men, Jamie Fraser's dislocated shoulder. He was injured during a battle with the Redcoats. When Claire sees the Highlanders' rough attempts to treat Jamie's injury, she warns them they might break his arm. Dougal allows her to try, and with careful maneuvering, she successfully resets Jamie's shoulder. Surprised by her skill, Jamie thanks Claire and reassures Dougal he can ride and continue their journey. Later, Claire notices the absence of electric lights in what should be Inverness, and realizes she is no longer in the 20th century. Dougal threatens to slit her throat if she attempts to escape, and helps her mount Jamie's horse. Jamie adjusts his plaid to shield Claire from the snow, and informs her they will ride for at least 2 nights. As the group travels, Claire remembers Frank mentioning Cocknam Rock as a site where English soldiers laid ambushes. She shares this with Jamie and explains that she overheard it in the village. Jamie then warns Dougal, who grows suspicious of Claire's knowledge. Regardless, they take her tip and successfully outmaneuver the English men. Unfortunately, when the group resumes their journey, Jamie collapses from his injuries. Turns out, he was shot in the arm by an English soldier. Despite limited supplies, Claire cleans and dresses the wound. By morning, the group arrives at Castle Leoch, now fully intact. Claire is struck by the surreal realization that just 2 days earlier, she had visited its ruins. Mrs. Fitz, a lively woman, welcomes the group warmly and directs them to the kitchen for food. After exchanging playful banter with Murdoch, she notices Claire and is introduced to her. Jamie explains that Murdoch found Claire, and Dougal decided to bring her along. Claire insists that Jamie needs medical attention, and Mrs. Fitz guides them to a room where they can treat his wound with herbal remedies. While tending to Jamie's injuries, Claire sees the severe scars on his back. Jamie shares that he was kidnapped and beaten twice in 1 week by Redcoats, under Captain Jack Randall's orders. He recounts how he tried to protect his sister Jenny from Randall's assault, only to be beaten and taken prisoner. Though the memory is painful, Jamie tries to lighten the mood, and Claire finishes tending to his wound. Later, Mrs. Fitz helps Claire dress in 18th century clothing. Once dressed, she is taken to meet Mackenzie, the laird of the castle. In the meeting room, Claire looks through books and finds a letter dated November 1st, 1743. This confirms that she has actually traveled in the past. Colum, who walks with difficulty due to his disfigured legs, welcomes Claire warmly and introduces himself. He questions her about how she ended up in the woods. Claire sticks close to the truth, explaining that she is a widow traveling to France with her servant when they were suddenly attacked by highwaymen. She claims she escaped but lost her belongings and was later attacked by Captain Randall. Colum listens and then assures her they'll discuss arranging her transport to Inverness. He mentions that a tinker named Sean Petrie will be passing through in 5 days and might take her along. Later, Claire wanders outside, planning her return to Inverness and the standing stones at Craigh to find a way back home. That evening, she reluctantly attends dinner in the hall. She approaches the head table, where Colum sits with his wife Letitia and Dougal. After a brief introduction, Colum pours Claire wine and inquires about her lodgings. As they converse, he questions Claire's surname pronunciation, noting it differs from the French style. She explains that her family's ties to France are distant, and that they likely changed the name long ago. The next morning, Claire changes Jamie's bandages and offers him lunch at the stable. During their conversation, Jamie reveals there's a £10 bounty on his head, an amount that would take farmers a year to earn. He explains that after escaping from Fort William, where he was kept a prisoner, a guard was killed during the breakout. Although Jamie was too weak to fight, he was blamed for the murder. Claire realizes Jamie's name, MacTavish, is fake and calls it a war name. Jamie is amused and admits it isn't his real name. Before they can talk further, Jamie is called back to work. He thanks Claire for the food, and she advises him to stay out of trouble. As Claire leaves the stables, she notices Rupert, one of Dougal's men, following her. She then confronts Dougal, demanding to know why she's being watched. Dougal accuses her of being an English spy and insists she's hiding something. He says she will be monitored until they're sure she's not a threat. Claire boldly tells him it doesn't matter since she's leaving with the tinker on Saturday. Determined not to give Dougal any more reasons to suspect her, Claire spends the next few days helping with the harvest. While gathering mushrooms, a woman named Jalys Duncan warns her that some of them are poisonous. Jalys introduces herself and jokes about the rumors that Claire might be a spy. She offers to teach Claire more about herbs and medicines and invites her to visit her in the village. That night, Claire attends a gathering in the castle's main hall, where Colum oversees disputes among the people on Mackenzie land. As the session continues, a father angrily brings his daughter forward, accusing her of improper behavior. Colum decides she must be punished, but Jamie steps in to take her place. Despite his injuries, Jamie chooses to endure a beating. Claire is horrified but learns he did it to protect the girl from public shame. Later, Jamie explains it was easier for him to endure the punishment than for the girl to suffer lasting humiliation. Mrs. Fitz then thanks Jamie for his sacrifice, revealing the girl is her granddaughter, Leoch. The scene cuts to the day Claire is set to leave. However, Dougal informs her that Colum wants to see her. Colum then takes her to a room filled with herbs and medicines, explaining that it was once used by their healer, who has since passed away. He insists Claire take up the role of healer for the castle. She protests, reminding him that she is leaving the castle for good. However, Colum clarifies she is staying, not as a guest but under his watch. Claire then realizes she is now a prisoner. Flashback to 20th century London. Claire and Frank are at the train station as she prepares to leave for the war. Frank asks her to promise she'll return to him once the war is over. Claire assures him she will and boards the train. Back in the 18th century, Mrs. Fitz bathes Claire with cold water, saying it's good for clear thinking and strength. She also talks about the upcoming gathering, where men from across the Highlands will pledge loyalty to Colum Mackenzie. Claire realizes she might gain the Mackenzie's trust by helping with healing duties. She sees this as her chance to prove herself, and, eventually, find a way back home. While Claire works in her room, Angus, her guard, leaves to drink with Rupert in the kitchen. Just then, a loud crash of glass startles everyone when a maid named Shona MacNeil drops something. Mrs. Fitz tells her not to worry and advises her to go home to her other children. After Shona leaves, Claire asks who the woman is. Mrs. Fitz explains she is Colum's chambermaid who is grieving her son Lindsay, who passed away the night before. Claire is puzzled as to why she wasn't called to help the boy. Mrs. Fitz explains that Lindsay's illness wasn't something mortal hands could heal. Angus adds that the boy had visited the Black Kirk. Mrs. Fitz clarifies this refers to the ruins of an old Benedictine monastery, rumored to be cursed. She believes demons are to blame and that Satan targeted the boy because he was weak. The young boy named Tammuz enters to summon Claire to Colum's chambers. Mrs. Fitz affectionately introduces him to Claire as her nephew, and mentions that Lindsay was like a brother to him. In Colum's chambers, he requests Claire to massage his deformed legs, explaining that his previous healer used to ease his pain this way. She agrees and suggests she focus on the base of his spine. Colum then wonders aloud what he did to deserve such punishment from the devil. He asks Claire if they have demons in her homeland, and she jokes that they call them Scots. Amused, Colum laughs, then groans in relief as the massage eases his pain. He is pleased with her work and invites her to join him in the hall that evening to listen to Gwilyn the Bard. She gratefully accepts his invitation. Later that evening, the clansmen gather in the hall for a much-awaited performance. Claire sits on a bench next to Leoch, Mrs. Fitz's granddaughter, and they notice Jamie entering and chatting with others. She comments that Jamie is handsome, and Leoch agrees but adds that Jamie doesn't fancy her. The next day, Claire is out in the castle gardens gathering plants. Jailey's Duncan joins her to help collect herbs. She complains about being stuck with Father Bain, who plans to perform an exorcism on Tammuz Baxter, Mrs. Fitz's nephew. She explains that Tammuz fell ill after visiting the Black Kirk with Lindsay MacNeil. Jailey's believes the boy is possessed, but Claire suggests he might just be sick. Jailey's warns her that most people think the boy is possessed, and saying otherwise could put her in danger. However, Claire decides to investigate the matter. Inside the Baxter house, Claire finds Tammuz tied to the bed and groaning in pain. Mrs. Fitz explains they tied him up because he might become violent due to the demons. Claire observes his symptoms and suspects that he might have been poisoned. Just then, Father Bain arrives to perform an exorcism. Claire suggests she can help the boy, but Mrs. Fitz prefers to let the priest continue. The next day, Claire asks Jamie to take her to the Black Kirk. At the site, Jamie explains that the Black Kirk is a rite of passage for the local boys. He did it without harm, but a cousin got sick for a week afterward. Claire asks if he believes demons made his cousin ill. Jamie says he doesn't believe in demons but admits that Highlanders don't like to take chances with fate. Claire then asks what he and the other boys did to prove their manhood. Jamie explains they mostly ran around, climbed walls, or defied the devil by urinating on the stones. Sometimes they found berries or wood garlic to eat. Claire asks him to show her some wood garlic, but when he does, she tells him it's not wood garlic but the lily of the valley, a poisonous plant. After the realization, Claire quickly returns to Baxter's home, where Father Bain is performing an exorcism on Tamas. Mrs. Fitz tells Claire the boy is nearly dead. Claire insists she can save the boy's life, revealing the lily of the valley plant and explaining it's poisonous. She says she can counteract the poison, but must act fast. However, Father Bain calls it blasphemy and demands she leave. Thankfully, Mrs. Fitz supports Claire and angrily tells Father Bain to step away. Claire then begins to treat Tamas, giving him a mixture of belladonna. She tells them that it will stabilize his heart and lower his blood pressure. As the family watches and prays, Tamas slowly regains consciousness. Mrs. Baxter calls it a miracle, and Mrs. Fitz proudly blesses Claire. That night, Jamie eagerly invites Claire to sit with him for the bard's performance. He translates the Bard Gwilyn's song for her, which tells the story of a man. On the eve of Samhain, he hears the sad singing of a woman from a fairy hill. Jamie translates the song, revealing the woman to be from Balnain, who was repeatedly stoned by her people. He recounts how she stood on a hill where the wind rose, and thunder rumbled across the land. Placing her hands on the tallest stone, she found herself transported to a distant land, where she lived among strangers who became her lovers and friends. However, upon seeing the moon and feeling the wind rise again, she touched the stones once more and returned to her homeland, resuming her life with the man she had left behind. Claire asks if the woman came back through the stones, and Jamie confirms she did, saying they always do. Claire thinks it's a folktale and madness to believe in such things, but the song describes her own experience. She realizes that if half of the story is similar to hers about a woman leaving her home, then why not the part where the woman returns? She then recalls what Jaylis had said earlier: there are many things in this world that can't be explained. Feeling a new sense of hope, Claire decides to escape from Leoch and find her way back, no matter the cost.